Chapter 90 Reasons You Are Listening at Novel Full. Audio. Eisen held the bow he made within the last 30 minutes in front of himself and toward Comer, who was speechlessly looking at the old man that managed to create such an amazing bow in such a short amount of time. Stop scamming people, Comer. Sell things like these, and you may actually be able to get away with a good conscience. The small crowd that formed around them began talking amongst themselves. Some of them were talking about Comer's small street shop, although the majority was rather mentioning how amazing Eisen's skill was. Embarrassed at this, Comer gulped loudly and tried hiding his face as he began to blush softly. I'm sorry, Eisen. I didn't think you were actually skilled like this. I think I should go. Comer squatted back down onto the ground and began packing up all of the items he had on his blanket. Comer, do you stay at an inn? Let's talk there. Eisen suggested, and Comer quietly nodded. So, Eisen, Bree, Kuria and Comer quietly made their way toward the inn that Comer was staying at. After Eisen paid for a room with multiple beds for his party to sleep in, where they then decided to talk. When they were inside, Eisen sat down on the bed and looked at the young, red-haired man. Bree, could you take Kuria for a bit and just go on a walk? I think it's time for a 1.1 talk with Comer. Sure. Then we'll be back in about 30 minutes. Bree asked and tilted her head before walking up to Kuria and taking her hand. Sounds good, thank you, Bree. And sorry for being so demanding today. With a smile, Eisen watched as Bree and Kuria left the room, and then turned to Comer who sat down on the bed directly next to Eisen's. So. Why are you doing this, Comer? I noticed right away that you wanted to trick me, but when it ended up going far worse than I thought, I couldn't hold back. What you tried selling to me was basically useless, as if you found it in the garbage. Quite harshly and without holding anything back, Eisen looked Comer deep into his eyes. From his reaction immediately after being called out in front of the Merchants Guild, Eisen could feel that Comer wasn't a bad kid deep down. And so, Comer began to explain. He was the son of the CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the world, which was the biggest investor to Prime Industries during the creation of World of Magic as well, which meant that they got the largest amount of spots for players amongst the investors. It seemed like Comer's father had a slightly twisted sense of humor, so he made Comer and his two brothers compete for the spot of who could take over the company once he retired. The three of them were chosen as players, and each of them had to build up their own merchant company. The one that would become most successful within 1 year, would be allowed to inherit the business. Comer was the youngest out of his brothers, and the only one that didn't yet finish his college education, and he always had a thing for tricking people into doing what he wanted. So, since he couldn't rely on business experience like his brothers, he did what he could best. Trick people into doing what he wanted. And that slowly spiraled into basically becoming a scammer, especially once he gained the charisma stat through continuously convincing others of his opinion. So that's why, Alright, let me help you. First off, what's your current goal? Eisen asked, and Comer opened his eyes wide in surprise. You want to help me? Thank you, Eisen. My plan was to get funds here in town by selling items, and then buying a carriage, to transport items from one town to another, and re-sell everything there. There's not much else I can do at this point. Comer sighed out while fiddling with his fingers, looking down at the ground. Eisen stood up and handed Comer the bow that he made once more. I have an idea what you can do. Instead of lying about horrible items being godly, make your customers think even better of items that are truly of quality. Sell my items. This way, you can make money and gain business experience at the same time. Wait, really? Comer stood up in surprise and looked up at Eisen standing in front of him. Yes, really. But under a few conditions. No scamming. You won't tell others that my items are godly creations, you will only tell facts. You can exaggerate those a bit, I know that's basically normal. But don't twist the facts around. Don't sell them 100 times their actual value, but find their true market value. Okay. I tell you, you won't regret this, Eisen. With your items, I may actually be able to create a huge merchant company. Well, if they're all as great as this bow, of course. Although this was only made with random wood, right? So if you made one with actually high-quality wood and make some kind of artifact, wouldn't I be able to actually call the tree it came from holy? Muttering to himself about different plans, Comer smiled brightly now that he had an actual source of items, although he still seemed to have a hard time letting go of his trickery. But that was fine, one step at a time. But Eisen still couldn't let this go. He crossed his arms and frowned strongly, before very clearly stating, Comer. No. Scamming. Fine, I get it. It was just a joke. Anyway, you've been playing for a while, right? Could you give me any tips? Comer asked, trying to quickly change the topic. This left Eisen to sigh loudly before nodding. Yeah, I've played for a little more than a real week, so more than a month in the game. What kind of tips do you need? How to get an occupation maybe. Or even what an occupation does for you, because right now, it doesn't seem like there's any benefit to it. I can just do whatever I want without one, right? Actually, no. I thought so at the start as well, though. Without any occupation, you won't be able to get past level 15, and all of your skills will be limited to rank 3. However, with an occupation, you can get to whatever level you want, and you will be able to rank skills up further than 3. And if you want to get an occupation, it seems that you just need to go to a person with the occupation you want, convince them that you're trustworthy, and they may offer you the occupation. Eisen began explaining these types of things one after another, including how most skills worked and the way that he figured out interaction with the inhabitants of the game world influenced your whole game experience. Then, Eisen also began to explain who he was, since Comer told Eisen so much about himself as well. Of course, the young man was quite shocked to hear who the originals actually were to the game, and that Eisen was skilled in basically every craft there was, and not just woodworking. At first it seemed kind of hard for him to believe, but in the end, I'm sorry for thinking you're just a random old man, Eisen. And thanks for basically insulting you to your face. Don't worry Comer, you're still young. You've got plenty of time to learn. Eisen laughed out loudly and waved at Comer to have him leave the inn's room together with him, and then quickly locked the door. You've been here for a while, right? I've heard that this town supplies a nearby mining town with different foods, so there must be a large merchant around. Let's see if we can get someone to give you a merchant occupation there. Eisen explained, and then made his way to the front desk to ask the innkeeper to tell the Fey-kin they were with earlier that they made their way to the stable, and that they should meet up there. A stable? Didn't you just say we're going to the merchant? Comer asked confused, tilting his head to the side. With a soft laugh, Eisen nodded. Yes, we are. But not right away. I can see that you're not wearing your basic clothes that you wore when you started, but these still aren't good enough to conduct business in. And I'm going to tell this to you once, and only once, but I'm lending something to you. Only lending. Not gifting, you'll have to give them back once we're done at the merchant. Eisen explained with a serious expression, and Comer gulped loudly before nodding. Should I be scared? He asked, but Eisen simply chuckled. Only if you don't behave. After only a few minutes, the two of them were already at the stable, and Eisen walked up to his carriage after greeting Kabaram properly. Oh, you've got a wagon and a horse too. How much did they cost? Comer asked curiously, but was incredibly surprised at the answer. I couldn't even give you an estimate if I wanted to. I only bought the raw materials, and built everything myself, so it was a lot cheaper than usual. Wait, you built this whole carriage yourself? You really are an amazing craftsman then, huh? But what about the horse? How much do these cost? Comer asked, leaning in closely toward Kabram's body to investigate the weird noise of gears that he started hearing when he stood next to him. But Eisen simply began to laugh once more. After all, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. Comer, I was talking about both the carriage and the horse. His name is Kabram, by the way. He's an automaton. What, an automaton? Isn't that something like a robot? The young man asked in confusion. Basically, yes. But he's made with magically powered gears rather than motors, and can actually somewhat think for himself. This wolf lady here is also an automaton, so don't be surprised. Wow! Wouldn't these be amazingly expensive if you began selling these? Comer whispered to himself, starting to think about whether or not he should try and build up a robotic empire together with Eisen. That might really be quite profitable, after all. But Comer tried to refrain from asking such a question, since Eisen was currently trying to help him with something else. After searching through the carriage for only a few seconds, Eisen came back out carrying his suit over his arms. Put this on. As I said, it's only borrowed. I made this for me, so I don't know if it will look as intended on a body like yours, but it should fit quite well at the very least. Wow, you can even make suits like this. Wait, then would I even be able to build up a brand with all these different types of items? Don't worry about that for now. First, you have to actually become qualified to sell items in the first place. Now go on and change. You can leave your clothes in the carriage if you want, I doubt anyone will steal them. Eisen explained while Comer stepped through the back door and closed it behind himself. The old man waited outside the carriage for a few minutes, simply talking to his pets Alu and Kabram for a bit, before the door opened up again, and out came a young man wearing the black suit with red details that Eisen thought to be quite well made and stylish. And considering that Comer's hair wasn't a natural red, but rather the type you can only achieve by dyeing it, and its tone was quite similar to the red Eisen chose for the details such as the tie, the suit fit even better to Comer than Eisen expected. And luckily, he was able to figure out how the size-fitting system of the game worked as well. It seemed to change its shape to roughly fit the general size of the person, but in this case, for example, the pants and shirt seemed to be ever so slightly too long. But it wasn't anything major, so it shouldn't be a problem, especially considering that it would give Moram another 10 points to charisma. Now, shall we go get you your occupation? Chapter 91 Hi Merchant, you are listening at NovelFull.audio. Shortly before making their way to the largest merchant company in town, Eisen and Comer met back up with Bree and Kuria while Kabram and Alu still stayed behind at the carriage for protection. At first, Eisen expected a large building with a huge amount of traffic, but the merchant company seemed to take up only one office floor of the rather small building it was situated in. And in the end, that should have been expected. After all, even if it was the largest company, since this was only a small village, it still wasn't too big. So, Eisen, Comer, Bree and Kuria stepped into the building and looked around. It was a rather crowded space, with desks placed wherever there was space in the room behind the front desk. The merchants were quite loud as well, which was to be expected considering that the whole room was basically packed to the brim with men and women of different stature. But that seemed to be quite unusual, since there simply couldn't be that many different merchants in such a small village. Curious, Eisen walked up to the woman at the front desk and asked if something was going on, and the busy secretary nodded hurriedly, but still took her time to be professional and tried to answer Eisen as best as she could. Yes, sir, something is going on. Have you heard of those people that suddenly appeared out of thin air? Most of them seem to be natural merchants, and especially two of them are quite troubling. They instantly bought up a large majority of food in some towns around here, and are now selling them at a largely increased price. Since this town was the only one in the area that didn't fall victim to this, many merchants are now trying to buy whatever food we have, so this has turned into quite a troublesome situation. Anyway, how can I help you? After this explanation, Eisen frowned strongly. Some players bought up so much food. How was that possible at this point in time? And it seemed like not only Eisen was asking himself that, but Comer was deep in thought as well. Eisen chuckled lowly and slapped Comer's back to get his attention, and then faced the secretary once more. My young friend here would like to talk to the owner of this merchant company, if this is possible. Eisen smiled softly and looked at the secretary, who in turn simply sighed out loudly. I'm sorry, I'm afraid that won't be possible. There are many people here that want to talk to the owner currently. She smiled wryly, seemingly actually sorry that this situation was such an inconvenience to Comer. Are you sure? I really just need to talk to him for a second. Comer protested, hoping that the extra charisma from the suit would take effect, but this seemed to be a situation that pure charisma couldn't overcome so easily. After a bit of discussion, Comer ended up giving in and sighed loudly as he was just about to turn around to leave. But Eisen didn't want Comer to become unmotivated because of something like this, and then turned to the secretary again. Would it be possible if we stepped inside and talked to one of the other merchants currently inside? It doesn't necessarily need to be the owner. I guess that would be fine. But if they don't want to talk to you, I would please ask you to leave them be. They are here for business as well, after all. The secretary explained, and Eisen nodded in response. Of course. Thank you. Comer started frowning as he looked into the large room with immensely busy people, not even knowing where to start. While he was doing that, Eisen held his hand in front of his eye in the same way that he did when inspecting Comer, in order to look at more information about the merchants. Luckily, people didn't seem to get shivers when being inspected with truth-seeing eyes, quite opposite to appraisal, so simply appraising such a large amount of people wouldn't be a problem. But it seemed that most of them weren't that skilled in the first place. The majority of the people in here simply had the occupation, merchant apprentice, and since these wouldn't be able to help out Comer by giving him an occupation, Eisen immediately skipped over them, until he saw a rather interesting individual. A man standing at the far wall, maybe about 30 years of age, who was wearing incredibly high-quality clothes compared to most others in the room and even had some small accessories like different rings. But most surprising was the information that Eisen got through the inspection. Antonio Hastings, race. Elf, occupation. High merchant, level 103. Eisen immediately deactivated his truth-seeing eye, since he knew he had the right person to teach Comer the merchant profession. So, Eisen tapped Comer's shoulder and signaled him, as well as Bree and Coria to follow. Of course, since Coria was quite short and very child-like in general, Eisen took her up on his arms and carried her through the room instead. When they then stood in front of him, Antonio the high merchant looked at the group confused. Can I help you?" he asked with a frown, and Eisen nodded with a smile. "Yes, you actually can. My friend here would like to become a merchant himself, and since you seem to be the most skilled one out of all the people here, we thought it would be a good idea to ask you." Eisen quickly explained, and Antonio looked Comer up and down. It seemed like Comer began to shudder for a second, which was a sign that Antonio probably used appraisal on him. "You want me to teach such a spoiled kid how to be a merchant? How old is he?" 20, and he's only level 4. A kid like that would never be able to become a merchant, no matter how fancy they dress. "Sorry, but come back once you convince me otherwise," Antonio said quite smugly, as if openly making fun of Comer without even letting him defend himself. But Eisen didn't allow something like this. This was just an incredibly insensitive way to turn someone down. "I know you have seen his status, although I don't know how much of it. If you can see his titles, I'm sure there should be an Omega title somewhere. That is a title that only those people that appeared out of thin air a few days ago have. As you should know, these people are quite skilled as merchants." Surprised, Antonio looked back into the open air, probably reading through Comer's status once more, and then began to frown. "An Omega, huh? Fine, I guess you should be able to do at least something, kid. How high is your trading skill?" Comer smiled wryly and laughed lowly. "Ah, it only just became rank 1 not too long ago. He explained, and Antonio nodded after crossing his arms. Fine, that should be good enough. Let's see what you can do. Meet me in front of the Merchants Guild tomorrow morning before sunrise, got it? If you're too late, you missed your chance. The elven merchant explained and jerked his chin toward the exit, simply signaling the group in front of him to leave again. Somewhat speechless, they did as they were prompted to and left the guild without much arguing, even though Eisen was quite annoyed at how rude Antonio was. And it wasn't only him, apparently. Arg, that guy was so rude, right? And now I have to do his dumb quest. Comer yelled out while crossing his arms in a pout accompanied by a frown, and Bree quite quickly agreed. That was to be expected. Elves that are older than 100 years are usually like that, and most people with high charisma stats as well, and since most merchants have high charisma stats. That was quite a bad combination. She explained, and both Comer and Eisen looked at her confused. Bree, you mean that Antonio is really that old? Eisen asked, and Bree nodded slowly. Yeah, at least he seemed like it. Elves age far slower than races like humans or dwarves from the moment they turn 18, so once you know the rate at which they age, it's pretty easy to figure out an elf's age. He seemed to be around 180 years old. Huh, interesting. I didn't know that. How curious that a man that looks like 30 is actually that old. Eisen muttered out, and Bree nodded with a wry smile. Emicham. But aren't you also millennia old despite looking like you're around 60? While Eisen chuckled lowly after having forgotten about that part of the game's story, as well as feeling quite flattered at being told he looked 10 years younger than he actually was, Comer stared at them in surprise. What do you mean, he's millennia old? And that was when Eisen realized that he didn't actually tell Comer about this, and Bree seemed to have noticed what she said just now as well. The old man sighed out loudly and leaned in to whisper into Comer's ear. After hearing what Eisen told him, Comer looked at Eisen with wide eyes. Really? You're one of those? He muttered out impressed. He heard about the 5 that peaked quite early on after gathering as much information about the world that he could, so he especially mentioned the craftsman so that he could sell his items more easily. Now Comer was feeling even more embarrassed about what happened before. But the one that reacted in disbelief out of the group was Bree, more than anyone else. Ha! Don't you think that's just super amazing? How can you not react to that? When I first heard about it, I was staring blankly at Eisen for days because I couldn't believe I was his friend. She exclaimed loudly, enough to get some passing glances from people walking around the street, and Comer flinched lightly in response while Eisen chuckled. Bree, he's been in this world for about a week. I mentioned that he was one of the Omegas, the people that appeared out of nowhere, just now, right? So he couldn't possibly think that those that peaked are as amazing as you do. I guess you're right. Sorry. But still, isn't Comer basically a part of you? Shouldn't he feel more excited? She asked, still visibly confused. Only now she wasn't alone. Now it was also Comer staring on in confusion. Don't worry Comer, I'll explain it to you at the inn. We should try to not let too many people hear about it. Eisen sighed loudly and began walking toward the stable so that Comer could change his clothes again. Once they were back at the inn itself, the group of 4 made their way back to Eisen, Bree, and Kuria's room, and Eisen began explaining what was going on with those that peaked and the appearance of players to him. Oh, wow. So that's what's going on. Interesting. Wait, if that got out, couldn't we use that as amazing marketing? Especially if we advertise that I get the items I sell from the first person that ever peaked in this world. Comer suggested, and this time around, it seemed like a genuine suggestion rather than a way to scam others into buying his items, so Eisen gave it a chance and thought about it for a bit. Well, maybe. But we really should wait with that, if we do it at all. As long as we haven't figured out what's going on with that fanatic church, we definitely can't even think about it. And we should wait for everything to calm down, just take a look at what those other omegas caused. Just take the time until then to gather experience and to make a name for yourself. Carefully and simply, Eisen explained what the best actions to take in that regard would be in his opinion, and Comer seemed to understand and accept it quickly. Alright, that's fine. I don't want to give out personal information about you, especially after you helped me this much. Comer smiled, and then looked deeply at Eisen with a calm and grateful face. Really, thank you for that, Eisen. Eisen looked at the young man, or rather kid most of the time, in front of him and began scratching his beard with satisfaction behind his smiling expression. Of course, Comer. Chapter 92 Antonio Hastings. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The next morning, Eisen, Bree and Coria went to eat breakfast in a nearby restaurant, before seeing if they could meet back up with Comer somewhere near the Merchants Guild. He was already out and about quite early to start that quest that Antonio the High Merchant gave him yesterday, so they couldn't see each other once more before then. But Eisen was sure it would work out in the end. After all, Comer did seem quite intelligent once Eisen talked to him some more, and he definitely wouldn't have any problems talking to, or luring in, potential customers. And it didn't actually take long for Eisen to find the young man, as he was currently the one selling items at a stall where a huge crowd ended up gathering. Luckily, it wasn't really all that hard for him to see what was going on, since he was at the very least a whole head taller than the majority of people standing in front of him. It seemed like Comer was currently selling different smaller items, most of them apparently being items that made day-to-day life easier, like some small enchanted crystals. But those weren't the only items that people took interest in, as Comer was also selling quite a large amount of jewelry that one wouldn't expect people living in such a small village to be wearing. But they were selling incredibly well anyway. And that was when Eisen saw why. This jewelry was being sold in the high copper to low silver range, although they should have been sold in the high silver to low gold range at the very least. Eisen took a look to see if he found anything weird about this jewelry that might be a good reason for Comer to sell them this cheaply, and then saw that these didn't actually seem to be that high quality, and actually rather poorly made. There were scratches all over the surface of any type of gem or crystal embedded in them, and part of the base were absolutely misshapen. It didn't seem like you could actually put on some of the rings that were being sold. I guess it does make sense if they're being sold so cheaply then. Eisen muttered out. Most of these things seemed to actually be made of non-metal materials that couldn't be easily reused, so despite them being made of high-quality base materials, such as bones or claws of monsters, they weren't items that you could usually sell at a high price. And behind Comer, Antonio was getting all of these different items out of different small wooden boxes, so these were probably items that Antonio himself couldn't sell, but somehow still needed to get rid of. And when the seemingly skilled merchant took his eyes off of his student, he saw Eisen and began to smirk lightly before walking around the crowd to talk to the old man. "Good morning. You here to check up on the kid?" Antonio asked while extending his hand for a greeting, which Eisen quickly returned. "Yes, actually. That's exactly why we're here." Eisen chuckled lowly and began scratching his beard with a light smile on his face. After looking over at Bree and Coria, Antonio once more turned to Eisen and jerked his chin to a spot on the other side of the marketplace that was currently completely empty. "Would you mind if we talked about something without these two ladies?" he asked, and Eisen nodded, although he was slightly surprised at this sudden request. Sure. We're not really in a hurry anyway," Eisen said, and followed Antonio to the open spot by the side of the road. The elf was silent for a few seconds, simply staring at Eisen. The old craftsman was quite confused at what Antonio was planning, when he suddenly felt shivers all over his body. They were a lot weaker than usual, but they were still there, and Eisen knew what just happened. It seemed like Antonio used appraisal on Eisen. "As I thought. You're also not a regular person, are you? I've never heard of the original of the mechanical arts. And your Limit Breaker title reached quite a high stage as well, hasn't it?" But compared to that, your skills are incredibly low ranked. Someone of your age should have at least a few rank 7 skills, if not rank 8. Antonio said quite clearly, not beating around the bush or trying to hide that he appraised Aizen. But Aizen simply began to laugh. After all, he already had a story prepared for him by the game itself. I can't actually tell you anything about all of that. My experience was stolen, so I don't remember my past. As such, I don't know where that original title came from. But it seems that I have kept some of my skill from before my experience was stolen, even if it's not reflected in my skills rank, so it was quite easy to John the Limit Breaker title. Aizen explained. He didn't want to tell Antonio at first, but now he basically had to. He probably wouldn't have believed any other explanation in the first place. However, Antonio's reaction was different than Aizen expected, or could have ever anticipated. Aizen would have thought that the elf would be surprised and maybe in disbelief while trying to find out some other truth, but instead, a wicked grin grew on his face. Oh. So you're him after all, then. The first person that ever peeked. Ha. Aizen muttered out in surprise, while Antonio simply kept on talking, his expression slowly turning toward ecstasy. I'm so glad to finally be able to meet you. I was quite sad when they went through the procedure without me. I'm a long-time fan of yours, after all. Antonio exclaimed, moving closer toward Aizen than he was comfortable with. But Aizen didn't know what was going on in the slightest. The procedure. What was Antonio talking about? Did he have anything to do with Aizen's backstory? What do you mean? What are you even talking about? Aizen asked, backing away slightly with a deep frown on his face, and Antonio simply began smiling brightly. Oh. Isn't it quite obvious? I'm a high merchant. I sell everything. So, I sold my services to those that need my help. One of my clients coincidentally wanted to acquire the experience of 5 people that peaked. And I always deliver. Always. But I wasn't really able to personally go for it this time around, so I was pretty sad. With pure glee in his voice, Antonio's personality basically did a complete 180, going from quite cynical and brutish all the way to a happy bundle of joy that was hiding quite a dark person. And Aizen had no idea which Antonio was the real one. But Aizen didn't know why Antonio suddenly revealed all of this. Why are you telling me about that? You know that this will not end good for you, right? Aizen looked Antonio deep into his sky-blue eyes, while the elf simply chuckled while starting to walk back toward Comer, turning around one last time before being close enough to be heard by anyone in the crowd, revealing his teeth in a diabolical smile. The way you are now, you can't do anything against me. So why should I be scared? Like that, Antonio Hastings, the elven high merchant that was in part responsible for stealing the experience of the 5 originals, revealed himself. Wow, having an occupation is really cool. And I was able to immediately become a regular merchant as well. Mr. Hastings told me that usually people become apprentices first, but since I was doing so well today he allowed me to skip that. Comer explained smugly, placing his fists on his hips as he basked in his own glory. However, Aizen wasn't as happy about all of this as Comer was. Of course he was glad that Comer was able to both get an occupation as well as actually learn what it was like to earnestly sell items without scamming others for a whole day. Of course he did somewhat exaggerate to get people's attention, but it was all still technically true, albeit heavily glorified. But still, what Aizen was more worried about was Antonio. After all, he seemed to be a person that was constantly scheming, and as such Aizen couldn't imagine that he really did all of this out of pure kindness. Aizen already explained the whole situation to Bree in private before, but didn't get the chance to tell Comer yet. Or rather, Aizen didn't really know if he should tell Comer too much right now. There was still something that he needed to know before then, and especially now that he got to know Comer's personality a bit better, Aizen knew that this would be worth a try. I'm really happy for you, Comer. But now that you are officially a merchant, what are you planning to do next? The old man asked, and Comer sat down on one of the beds in Eisen, Bree and Korea's room at the inn while they did the same. I'm not too sure. At least I know that selling actual items for the right price is easier and will make me a lot more money than trying to do what I tried yesterday with you. So I'm not sure. You said you would let me sell items for you, right? If so, and you're staying here for a while, we could just make money for a while like that. Sounds good, right? Comer suggested, but Eisen immediately shut him down. Sorry, but I don't think we'll do that. We spent today mainly just buying different food and ingredients that last for a while, since we're going all the way to the capital of Litgern, Ornir. Eisen explained, leaving Comer to frown sadly in response. Oh, I see. How are we going to do the thing with items then? Are you going to make some other automaton to deliver them to me, or something? I certainly could, but I have a better idea. Eisen chuckled and began scratching his beard while looking over to Bree to confirm once more she was really alright with this as well, and then looked back at the slightly nervous Comer. Why don't you join us, Comer? That way, I can keep practicing and ranking up my skill ranks by making items, which you can sell at each town we stop at. Surprised, Comer opened his eyes widely while starting to think about this more closely, playing around with a strain of his hair that he pulled down onto his face. After a few seconds, it seemed like he made up his mind and moved his fingers through his hair with a smile, before extending his hand in a business-style handshake. You've got a deal. Let's travel together, then. Comer exclaimed, and Eisen laughed loudly before shaking his hand in return. After this, the group continued talking for a while in a little celebration for their newest member, and then everyone went to sleep. The very next morning, they all met up back at the carriage that was already loaded up with a few different foods, such as pickled vegetables, dried fruits, and preserved meats, as well as larger quantities of things like vinegar, salt, pepper, or different herbs than they had before. It became a slight bit more crowded in the back of the carriage now, but it was still large enough for everyone in the group to gather with a bit to spare, so it was fine in the end. Eisen hooked Kabaram back up to the carriage and had him pull out the carriage out of the stable, before driving it all the way to the next gate they had to leave through to continue their journey toward Ornir. During all of this, Eisen felt cold stares in the back of his neck, as if he was being watched from the shadows. Chapter 93 Basics. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Bree was currently driving the carriage along the rough street of the plains on their way toward the capital of the human country Litgern, while Eisen and Comer were sitting in the back of the carriage, talking about business. What we should do first is give you a rough sense of the value of items. I'm sure you know why the items you were selling yesterday were priced so cheaply, right? Eisen asked, leaving Comer to nod basically instantly in response. Yeah, because they were all basically failures. At least that's what Mr. Hastings told me. Exactly. Which brings us to the first point. Quality. Together with the item's rank, it's probably the easiest way to get a rough idea of what something should cost without even looking at the effort to make it or the material. But again, you should only use it as a rough base point. Do you know how item ranks and quality work? The young man with vibrant red hair shook his head while crossing his arms. No, I don't really. And I'm guessing it's not random, right? It's not, yeah. There are 8 different qualities, lowest to perfect, at every rank. And it's still a fact that a lowest quality rank 1 item is still of better quality than a perfect quality rank 0 item. But the actual quality rating only slightly influences the price compared to the rank. The difference between an average quality item and a perfect quality item may only be a few coins, while the difference between a rank 0 item and a rank 2 item is like the difference between copper and silver coins. And that is because you need to be of a specific rank in the skill that you're making something with for the item to be that rank. Because it only gets harder to rank your skills up over time, rank 7 items are obviously quite rare compared to rank 1 or 2 items. Comer took in all of this information, even taking notes on a piece of paper to make sure he wouldn't forget anything, before turning back to Eisen to listen to the next part of what he knew about how to sell items. The quality will make the price of items vary the most. It's like an amplifier. Let's say you have a base item with a material worth of 1 copper coin, but it's an incredible rank 10 item. The item with a base worth of 1 copper will suddenly be worth 1 platinum coin. So, taking that into account, if you take materials that are worth 1 silver coin at the start and make a rank 10 item out of them, they will be worth a crystal coin instead. Nodding in response to this quite useful revelation, Comer noted this down as well. Of course, Eisen also added that this was just an example, and those were not in the slightest accurate numbers. But at least this helped Comer understand how quality really influenced the price of items, and that was the most important part about it. Next, there is of course the workload and complexity. Alu here will cost a lot more than other items with the same rank, quality, and material cost. And that's because it took me quite long to make her, at least for my standards, and because I used multiple different skills and crafts during her construction. That brings the price up as well. But that's something that you'll have to look into for every different type of item. Of course, I will also tell you how hard it was to make it and how long it took. Since I doubt I have to explain supply and demand to you, I'll move on to the something else, another important part that you even mentioned before. Eisen explained while setting up another flower pot with seeds in it for Coria to continue practicing her skills, and Comer scratched his chin while thinking about it, before he seemed to have realized what Eisen was talking about. Ah, do you mean the brand? Eisen sat back down on the floor opposite to Comer and nodded, since that was exactly what he meant. Of course. You said before that we could just sell items for a higher price by telling everyone they were made by me. That would definitely bring up the price, but we shouldn't jump into it too quickly. Reputation is probably the most important thing for a merchant, don't you think? If you had kept scamming people, your reputation would have dropped, and then even if you had sold actually god-tier items for a few copper coins, people would mistrust you and just not buy anything from you anyway. You have to slowly raise your reputation as a merchant, and then with that you can think about slowly raising your prices. Of course not by a lot, but a little bit is alright. So why don't we just sell items you made and tell everyone who you are then? Couldn't we instantly raise the price, then? After Comer asked this, Eisen sighed loudly and nodded. Yeah, of course we could do that. But if you tried selling items by advertising they were made by someone that peaked, not your reputation would rise, but mine. You would basically just be the clerk at the front of the store to people. We don't just want people to think that you're working for me, but rather that you're an amazing merchant that sells high-quality items. Oh. I didn't think about that. But that does make sense, yeah. Since the people here see you as such an amazing being, it would be like the big guy helping the little guy. Exactly right. So let's keep my identity a secret for now until you're more successful as a merchant. Eisen told his young, new companion. But Comer seemed to have something on his mind, and chose to just ask right away. Eisen. Why are you helping me like this? I tried scamming you, most people would just completely ignore me. Although Eisen was still hesitant about him, he knew that he wasn't a bad kid deep down. And Eisen knew quite well that people could change, so he wanted to give Comer a chance. Well, just because you're like this now doesn't mean that you'll always be like this. I have 3 kids that I had to raise on my own, so not all of them ended up doing too great in life at first. But now that I have grandchildren, I have a lot more people to worry about and became more conscious of everything again. Eisen explained while trying not to let Bree hear since she may ask some questions about it, and Comer was quite surprised himself. After all, you don't hear the sentence 3 kids that I had to raise on my own every day. Thank you, Eisen. You've already been amazing help to me. Without you I would probably still be sitting on the street trying to scam people. And you're doing all of that just because you've become more conscious about your grandchildren that I don't have anything to do with. That's incredible. The young man smiled, and Eisen began to chuckle while scratching his beard, before starting to whisper. You see, I'm not necessarily doing this out of complete goodwill. My oldest grandson will finish high school soon and enter college, so it can't hurt to have a contact in the largest tech company in the world, can it? Ah, I see. Well, I can't guarantee anything, but if your grandson needs a job after college, you can tell me and I'll try to hook him up with something. Comer answered with a wry smile, while Eisen simply grinned back. Of course that was only an excuse. While it may be true that having a contact in such a large company would be amazing for his grandchildren's futures, Eisen didn't yet feel completely comfortable to tell Comer all about the real reason. It would basically be just like running his mouth about Tony, after all, since Eisen couldn't really say anything good about that phase in his youngest son's life. But in Eisen's opinion, it was still a good reason to help out Comer with fixing his behavior. After a bit of silence, Comer looked at Coria, who was currently sitting in front of Eisen cross-legged while holding a wooden flower pot. Eisen, what's she doing? Her name is Coria, right? Surprised at her name suddenly being called, Coria looked up and then at Comer for a few seconds before turning her head to look at Eisen. It's nothing. Just keep practicing, okay? He smiled, and the small Myconid girl nodded before looking back at the pot. She's practicing some skills of hers. She's a Myconid druid disciple, so she's practicing the control she has over plants. Although nothing is happening right now. What are you doing there? Eisen explained while looking down at the soil that Coria seemed to be currently pouring her mana into. It somewhat made sense that barely anything was happening when her plant control skill was still rank 0, but now that it was rank 1, it should be possible for Coria to quite easily make at least a small flower grow. She has done it before, after all. Once more, Coria looked up at Eisen, who once more chose to ask. Coria, are you actually practicing? Immediately, she nodded her head quickly before turning back toward the flower pot, and continuing what she was doing. At first, nothing seemed to be happening, but after a bit, Eisen did see a change. The soil was slowly bulging up at the top, as if something was growing inside the ground, some of it even flowing over the edge of the wooden pot. But what Eisen gave her was simply a seed for a regular flower, so it shouldn't be growing under the ground. And after a few seconds, something shot up through the top layer of the soil to reveal a dark root standing up perfectly straight and vertical. You know how flowers work, right? Comer muttered out, and Coria frowned at her angrily before tapping Eisen's leg and motioning toward the root and pretending to be pulling on something. Do you want me to pull it out of the soil? The old man questioned, and Coria nodded happily. So, Eisen did as she instructed and slowly pulled on the root. While the product of Coria's practice slowly revealed itself, Eisen immediately became surprised. At first, it simply looked like a ball of roots that was created by Coria, until he took a closer look. It was hard to see at first since the whole thing was covered in dirt, but when Eisen actually removed all of that, he saw that the roots were formed into a thin grid to protect the small red flower growing inside. Oh, wow! So you had the flower grow inside of there. Quite an amazing idea, honey. Eisen praised with a smile and pet the top of Coria's head, while she happily leaned into his palm. So how did you get that idea? Eisen asked, and Coria immediately jumped up and pointed at the round egg lying on its wooden pedestal by the side of the worktable. So this is supposed to be an egg, then? A flower egg? He asked, before Coria nodded furiously and hugging Eisen tightly, practically leaving Eisen no choice but to praise her even more. You're quite amazing, aren't you? That was a pretty good idea to practice. And it looks quite nice as well. With a smile, Eisen stood up and set this small sphere of roots down next to the first flower that Coria made grow and blossom completely, before sitting down next to her and Comer again. Seems like Coria took after Eisen when it came to making things. Chapter 94 Glass Flowers. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. While Eisen was still praising Coria for making something so interesting, he suddenly got an idea. It looked really beautiful, although it was somewhat hard to see the flower in the center. It would probably be possible to sell these kinds of items, and might actually bring quite a good amount of profit. But since Aizen didn't want to treat Kureha as a production slave, it wouldn't be sold in high quantities, but since that meant there couldn't be a constant supply, it had to last longer than a regular flour would, that's for sure. And so, they would need something to cover the whole thing in so that it wouldn't wilt. The easiest thing to use for this would probably be something like epoxy resin, but the type that you could use for smaller crafts like this was usually synthetic, so Aizen couldn't get his hands on it if there wasn't a similarly suitable substance that was both as clear and easy to work with as epoxy resin. For now, though, Aizen chose something else to work with. He stood up and looked through some of the crates in the back of the carriage, before grabbing some glass bottles together with the 2 flowers made by Kureha standing on the shelf. He first grabbed the regular flour that Kureha created through plant control, and took one of the glass bottles in his other hand. Slowly, Aizen used transmutation on the glass to turn it more into a liquid, which was far easier at this point in time. Not only did Aizen manage to change the state of the glass far quicker than he used to be able to, but he also managed to turn it into a thick liquid rather than something like slime. The consistency actually reminded him a slight bit of honey. Aizen first formed a small base to set the flour on with this glass liquid so that it may look somewhat as if suspended in mid-air, and then covered the direct layer with the glass, using his transmutation to continuously change between its solid and liquid states to make sure he could properly fill out every little nook and cranny around the flour. So at last, Aizen only needed to expand from there, adding layer over layer of glass to the outside of the flour until it grew in size enough to be compared to a small version of the glass bell that the Rose in The Beauty and the Beast was kept in, although this one was completely solid all the way through instead of being hollow like the one in the movie. But this version still looked nice nonetheless, and it should be more than enough to keep the flour basically stuck in time. Oh, wow! That was amazing, Aizen. I didn't know you could do something like that. Komer said, surprised while leaning into the small decorative item that Aizen just created. There wasn't an alchemist in the town he started, so it made sense he would be surprised to see this for the first time. After all, changing the shape of something with your thoughts is just incredibly weird to see, isn't it? This is just a basic alchemy trick, kid. Maybe you should actually learn a higher variety of skills to get used to everything here. That reminds me, what kind of skills do you have? Aizen asked Komer while placing the glass-covered flour away and grabbing the root sphere that Kureha made. Komer scratched his cheek while seemingly opening his status page, before leaning against the wall. Not a lot, really. I have appraisal, trading, cooking and mana manipulation. Appraisal is my highest rank skill, and mana manipulation is my lowest rank one. Oh, and of course my racial skill, a human's perseverance. I see, then you really should learn a few more skills. Maybe a few crafting skills so that you can get a better feeling for the items you're selling as well. But mana manipulation might be surprisingly useful, so I suggest bringing that up to rank 2 as well. Although, maybe wait a bit until your trading skill is a bit higher and you actually became a proper merchant until you actually rank it up from 1 to 2. Aizen suggested, and Komer tilted his head lightly to the side. Why is that? As a merchant, being able to use magic isn't really all that useful, right? It actually is. Merchants probably have high mental stats rather than physical ones, so that's the perfect base for magic. And you do need to be able to defend yourself a little bit, considering that there are some pretty strong monsters. Also, when your magic manipulation reaches rank 2, you will get to choose a magic element. Depending on your actions, you may be able to get some kind of element that will end up helping you as a merchant. Komer frowned lightly but ended up nodding. This definitely made quite a lot of sense, even he had to admit that. When he first tried it, controlling your mana was just way too hard and underwhelming compared to those awesome things you read in novels. That's why his skill was still at rank 0, since he really didn't do anything to practice it after the first 2 or 3 times, especially after he suddenly passed out from losing too much of his mana. But if it could really be as useful as Aizen said, then maybe it would be worth continuing to practice it anyway. I mean, at the start you can barely do anything with mana, right? So I can't imagine it really changing all that much. But I'll trust you. So you also have that element thing then? He asked, and Aizen nodded as he faced his palm toward a small open spot in the carriage, before a figure suddenly appeared that was basically just an utterly white version of Aizen wearing a just as white suit. Before Comer could even react to this, the figure suddenly turned into dirt, or at least that's what it looked like at first. It didn't really seem to be dirt, and instead was moving in something like small waves, as if it was just some kind of smoke compressed into a body. Yes, I do. And trust me, you really can do quite amazing things with mana. The white version of me was the pure mana double, and right now it's been infused with my magic element. The element is quite useful for crafting, so that's why I got this. Aizen explained, and Comer kept staring at the other version of Aizen standing in the room, before it suddenly disappeared. So just keep practicing your mana manipulation for a while, and as I said, try to only get it to rank 2 once you've properly grown into your role as a merchant. Also, can you tell me what your human racial skill does? Aizen asked while preparing to also turn the root sphere into a decoration with the help of transmuted glass, but Comer only got confused. Air. What? You should know, right? Aren't you also a human? He asked, unsure what Aizen was talking about, but was incredibly surprised when he heard the answer. No, I'm actually not a human. I'm half giant, half dwarf, so my racial skills are different from yours. After explaining this, Aizen chuckled lowly as the glass bottle in his hand slowly began to drip down while he turned it into a liquid, slowly moving it over the root sphere. Comer was still surprised, but when he considered Aizen's dimensions, it actually made sense to see that he wasn't human. Alright. Anyway. A human's perseverance skill doesn't actually do all that much right now. It just makes me lose my stamina less quickly when I activate it, and if I activate it when I'm about to fall asleep because of exhaustion, I won't be tired during the duration of the skill. That's all for now. A man in the village told me that later, it would passively influence some of your abilities depending on your surroundings, but I don't really know. He explained, and Aizen nodded in response. I see. Hey, Bree, you also have a human's perseverance, racial skill, right? Aizen asked in a louder voice so that Bree could hear him while she was sitting on the bench at the front of the carriage, and she turned her head around to look inside. Yeah, I do. Why are you asking? It's just because of Comer. I wondered if you could tell us something about it. Bree tilted her head to the side and began to think for a bit, before nodding slowly. I guess you could say it's kind of an all-rounder ability at first, but it grows into a more specialized area depending on what kind of person you are later on. That's because humans live basically everywhere, in any type of area, and they don't really have a racial specialization. They don't get any bonuses to stats, but at the same time don't have any disadvantages either, but the racial skill can change that, so some humans are actually on par in ability compared to more specialized races like dwarves or elves. Aizen and Comer listened curiously, while Aizen was currently filling out the whole area inside of the sphere with liquid glass that he quickly hardened, before also covering the roots in a thin layer of glass to make sure that these couldn't rot either. And what did you specialize in? Well, in my case, it supports my mental stats for the most part. I see, thanks, Bree. You really have an answer to everything, huh? The old man laughed loudly while the sphere in his hand hardened and began glittering in the sunlight streaming through the small openings of the carriage. So, as you can see, you will be better off if you specialize on an area and concentrate on raising skills like these that will make you even better in that area. It's like synergy, you know. For example, in my case take tailoring and leatherworking. Since they are quite similar technique-wise, once I learned one, it was easier for me to learn the other. If you have a skill set that supports itself and pushes you up, you can grow to immense heights. Aizen chuckled, while placing the glass-covered sphere of roots down next to the other flower again, then looked back at Comer. Should I tell you about some of the items that you may be selling in the future? He asked, and Comer nodded excitedly while standing up. Yes, please. All right. Here, first these. And so, Eisen began to explain the main types of items that would probably be sold with the use of examples. This included the potions, pills, clothes, tools or weapons. And at last, Eisen also showed Comer some of the bottles of mead that he was currently preparing, that have already been fermenting for a few while now, every once in a while letting out small pops as air escaped through the small air locks at the top. And Comer was simply stunned. Wow, you're making all of this stuff. Is there anything you can't make? And you're even making alcohol. He muttered to himself while grabbing one of the honey containers that Eisen filled with the mead, curiously trying to figure out what this was. Did you make these? Bottles, as well. They look pretty cool. And they fit the mead theme too, since it's made with lots of honey, right? Comer asked, carefully placing it back down onto the pile of the other containers, while Eisen shook his head. No, I didn't make these. I found them in a giant beehive in a forest. The bees used those to store honey in, and a few of them were empty, so I grabbed all that I could get. That's actually also where I got this here. Eisen reached out toward the perfectly round amber-colored egg still lying on its pedestal. It's a queen bee egg, so I'm hoping to be able to tame it once it hatches, similar to what I did with. While Eisen was trying to explain his plan for the bee that would hatch from this, it actually began to shake a little bit. Apparently his luck was quite great, wasn't it? Chapter 95 Melissa, you are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The round amber-colored egg in Eisen's hand continued to shake for a little longer, until a few cracks formed on its surface, spreading outward until they covered the whole thing. Comer's eyes opened wide in surprise when he saw this happen, but leaned in closer to see what was going on. Is it hatching right now? Eisen kept quiet for a bit, but nodded in response to Comer's question, only after a few seconds answering properly. I think so, yes. At least I'm hoping that's what it is. Immediately following this sentence, parts of the egg's shell started to fall off as a small white form pushed outside, widening the hole that it just created as it crawled onto Eisen's hand. Congratulations. You just tamed a queen bee larva. Name the tamed beast. Eisen looked at the small, finger-sized larva crawling over his arm, while Comer was backing away from the slimy creature that emerged from the egg just now. Eisen chuckled and smiled, trying to think of a good name. For Corea, he went with the scientific name shown in her race, Muscaria amanita, as in Muse Corea, so he may do the same thing with this small larva as well. He wasn't entirely sure, but as far as he knew, the scientific names for bees usually had apis in them. But that just didn't sound great as a name in Eisen's opinion. So instead of using the Latin translation for bee, maybe he should use a translation into another language. Ah, I've got it. I'll call you Melissa. Eisen exclaimed the moment that he remembered what this name meant. And right now, it may be weird to call a larva with such a human name, but it would always be possible that she would grow into a humanoid form as well, just as Corea did. The tamed beast has been called Melissa, Nav OM, taming reached level 100 in rank 1, upgrading to rank 2, you can now command your beasts from a distance, due to ranking. Up your taming skill, you gained +1 INT and +1 WS. Eisen read through the notifications that popped up in front of him, and quickly read through the notifications. He was glad about the new function this skill just gained, as this would make it harder for him to lose sight of Corea and the newly hatched Melissa. He smiled as the larva began wiggling, as if trying to show Eisen that she was happy with her new name. She crawled up Eisen's arm until she ended up at his shoulder, stopping to rest there. Is my shoulder really that comfortable? You used to like sitting there a lot as well, right? He asked when looking at Corea, who stretched out her hand to give Eisen a thumbs up while nodding furiously. Well then, I honestly didn't expect her to hatch that soon. Anyway, Bree, let's take a break for a second. Sounds like I need to refill Kabram's tanks. Eisen exclaimed with a smile while taking the larva Melissa into his hands and setting her down on the spot that would be perfect for her to explore, the honey crystal hive standing in the corner of the carriage. Happily, she began wiggling her body again and dove straight into some of the openings all around it. Glad that she liked it, Eisen stepped out the door of the carriage the moment it came to a halt, bringing a canister of oil with him to feed to Kabram, the horse automaton. Eisen turned over to the Fey-kin who was still sitting on the bench at the front of the carriage while disconnecting Kabram from the carriage so that he could properly relax a bit. It may sound a bit silly to have a mechanical creature relax, but since Kabram gained quite a lot of intelligence throughout the past few days, he was acting more and more like a real horse, so Eisen felt bad to treat him like an object. Thanks for driving the whole day. I'll take over for the rest of the day, so you can just sit down in the back for a while. Eisen said, and Bree smiled at him while nodding. Okay, thanks. I never realized how exhausting it is to sit on your butt all day. Ah, you were talking to Comer about magic, right? Do you want me to teach him a few things? She offered, and Eisen thought about it for a while, but nodded as he held a bowl of oil in front of Kabram's mouth before the hatch at the back of the horse's throat opened up and he began drinking. Yeah, that would be great, actually. Could you teach Kuria at the same time as well? It can only help with her control, after all. Okay. Oh, and we'll be at a village again soon. It's a bit bigger than the last one, but there's nothing worth getting there so we should only pass through. It would be just a waste of time only to spend the night. They have a pretty good smithy, so maybe you're interested. Bree explained, and Eisen began to think about it for a while. Maybe. It's been a few days, and it's the only thing I can't do in the carriage, so I probably should get that out of the way. Do we need anything forged? Eisen asked, but Bree simply shook her head. No, I don't think so. I'm pretty sure we have everything we need. She shrugged while leaning back onto the wood of the carriage, watching Kabram still drink the oil inside of the bowl Eisen was holding up. I see, then I guess I can just play around a bit, haha. Eisen said with a big smile on his face, happy that he could casually forge for a while today, as long as the owner of the smithy allowed him to use the space, that was. Once Kabram was finally fed, Eisen let him relax for a bit while he sat down next to Bree on the carriage's bench, thinking about what he could make at the smithy that wouldn't just be random stuff that would just lay around in the corner at the end of the day. I guess I'll just be making a few tools. He told himself as he reconnected Kabram to the carriage after about half an hour of letting him do his thing, and then began driving the carriage further along the road. While Eisen was now sitting on the bench at the front of the carriage, Bree began to teach Comer and Bree the basics of magic control. It seemed like not too long after that, Comer's mana manipulation skill ranked up, since he kept laughing and yelling out excitedly after that, now that it was far easier to control his own mana. And this all continued until Eisen saw another village in the distance. From where he was then, it really did seem to be about double the size of the last village they stopped at, although it still wasn't really that big. When they reached the town's wooden gate, the guard standing there inspected the contents of the carriage again and then allowed the group to enter, which they did after Eisen asked one of the guards where the nearest stable was. Even though they wouldn't be staying too long, as both Comer and Bree seemed to want to accompany Eisen, and since he definitely had to bring Kuria and Melissa, he didn't want to just leave the carriage standing by the side of the road with only Kabram and Alu protecting it. So, they parked the carriage inside of the stable, paid the fee, and then Eisen changed his pants from the regular crafting pants he wore most of the time over to the ones that he specifically made for blacksmithing, so that he would only need to take off his shirt and put on the leather apron to be fully wearing his blacksmithing outfit. After this, the group made their way to the nearby smithy, with Eisen now having two tamed monsters basically crawling all over him. One literally, while the other was trying to hog him for herself due to jealousy over her new sibling. After a while, they reached the blacksmith of the town and quickly stepped inside. Hello. How can I help you today? The man standing at the counter asked with an excited smile when he saw the group enter. It seemed like he didn't really get customers that often. From what Eisen could tell, this man was probably the owner of the smithy, considering his overall build and attire. If possible, could I maybe use some space in your smithy to work? I'm also a smith, but as we're traveling, it will be a while until I can do so again. Eisen quickly explained, and the face of the man at the counter immediately dropped. Oh, so you're not here to buy something. Well, what's your occupation then? The man asked, and Eisen chuckled. It's Omni Craftsmaster. I'm not sure if you know it, but trust me, I'm a good blacksmith. Eisen explained, and the man frowned in response. Omni Craftsmaster. I know what a craftsmaster is, although I don't know what the Omni in front of it is for. Either way, if that's really your occupation, go ahead if you want, but you better pay for all the materials you use. And I'll watch you to make sure you don't mess around back there. The blacksmith said before leading the group to the actual smithy of the shop. Compared to the one in Melro, this smithy was incredibly tiny, only possessing a single forge to work at. Are you sure I can use this? Don't you need to work on this? Eisen asked concerned, but the owner of the smithy shook his head. Not really, no. Here in this village people only ever order farming tools, and I've got more than enough of those stocked up. He explained and leaned back in a chair he sat down on. That makes sense. Then I'll go ahead and use it. And it really did make sense. After all, the owner here couldn't just go ahead and make whatever he wanted, or make 100 of the same thing. That would just be a waste of money, and nobody could know if any of the items would actually end up being sold, especially if people around here only ever buy the same type of item. So, if the owner already had more than enough items to sell, it wouldn't make sense to just continue forging to fill up the front of the store. But for now, Eisen grabbed some steel ingots from the small storage space in the corner of the smithy, and threw them into the forge while grabbing his hammer and activating his Flame of the Earth transformation as well as his crafting space and his 2 racial skills. Once the steel ingot in the forge was glowing in a bright yellow color, Eisen grabbed it with the help of some tongs and brought it over to the nearby anvil, before starting to hammer onto the metal to shape it properly. Hit after hit, the steel changed its shape under the pressure of his own tool, bending to its will. Slowly, the steel ended up turning into the shape that Eisen wanted it to be in, a thin, lengthy piece of metal in a slight crescent, with one pointy end and one sharp, flat end. What Eisen was making right now was the head of a pickaxe. Once this part was done, Eisen quickly cooled it down and set it to the side for now. He would later still temper in a small makeshift tempering chamber like the one he constructed at Denmer's smithy, but that could wait until the other pieces of tools were ready. So, Eisen grabbed another steel ingot and threw it into the forge, once more waiting for it to become hot enough, which was when Eisen took it out again and started shaping it. Chapter 96 Magic Forge. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The next tool that Eisen was making was something that may be used more often than the pickaxe, an axe. For this, Eisen shaped the hot steel ingot into a flat square shape, and created a thin edge at one of the ends while thickening the end opposite to the edge to give enough space for the handle to pass through. Now that this was done as well, Eisen set the axe head down next to the pickaxe head, and then threw the next ingot into the forge for the next tool. He would also need to make the dagger for that crafting guild request he picked up before, but that wouldn't take all that long either, so it was fine to do it after he finished his tools. Once the steel ingot in the forge was glowing a bright yellow, Eisen grabbed it out of the forge again, right when he remembered a new part of his dwarven racial skill. Slowly, Eisen moved his fingers toward the glowing steel until his skin was pressed against it, and Eisen didn't feel any pain or lose any HP through this action. He would still move it around with a tong while crafting, though, since they would take up the least amount of space on the metal to let Eisen work more easily with it, but at least it was good to know that he could even handle something as hot as this with his bare hands now. But while Eisen was quite happy to see this, the owner of the smithy was nothing but confused. Are you a dwarf, by chance? He asked, already feeling quite silly to ask this man that was nearly double the height of what any dwarf should be, but to his surprise, this old man simply laughed as he began to work on the metal in front of him. "Ha, yeah, I'm a half-dwarf. My other half is a giant," Eisen explained while flattening the steel, and the owner of the smithy nodded slowly. "A half-giant. Well, that explains your height at the very least. Anyway, don't let me disturb you any more then, was just surprised to see you touching the hot steel with your hands." Eisen chuckled and nodded his head as he continued flattening the steel down quite a lot, until it was less than a centimeter thin and shaped it to have a rough U outline, just that it was completely filled out, and was slightly pointed at the round end. Because what Eisen was making right now was a shovel. As these were all quite simple tools, making any of the parts really didn't take that long, and Eisen managed to finish this within a little more than an hour, including the time it took to grind each edge down to be sharp enough. Now, after asking if this was alright, Eisen stacked some bricks on top of each other to make a small box, placed a few bricks onto the ground in the box to make sure that the steel parts wouldn't touch the burning coals that Eisen added in next, right before he placed the steel parts on top of them and closed the box off. It seemed like the owner was kind of confused at what Eisen was doing, but just let him do his thing anyway. So next, it was time to make the dagger for the guild request. Eisen threw another small steel ingot into the forge and waited until it was glowing in a bright yellow like always before grabbing it and placing it on the anvil. He quickly thinned it out and slightly lengthened it as well, before creating the edges of the dagger that lead all the way around the blade part, and then reshaped the part of steel where the handle would be attached later. Since it couldn't hurt to temper this small blade as well, Eisen placed it into the tempering box next to the tool parts and then stepped over to the group that watched him work. "Alright then, now we only need to wait for a bit. The parts will finish tempering soon, and then I can finish everything in the carriage," he explained while deactivating his skills and packed away his hammer, changing back out of the leather apron into his regular shirt before turning to the owner of the smithy. "Thanks for letting me use this space for a short while." Eisen smiled and the owner quickly nodded in response. "Yeah, of course. It was quite interesting to see someone with a master occupation at work. And as expected, you managed to finish all of these things incredibly quickly," he said with a smile, clenching his fist tightly in excitement. "Seems like I'm getting kind of pumped up to forge again myself." "Huh, then I'm glad I could help a youngster such as yourself." Eisen chuckled while moving his fingers through his beard before paying the owner of the smithy for the materials that he used. Suddenly, Eisen noticed some notifications in the corner of his eye that seemed to have popped up while he was working. Flame of the Earth magic reached level 100 in rank 1, upgrading to rank 2, state of element in can now be changed independently of other active areas, due to ranking. Up your Flame of the Earth magic skill, you gained +1 INT and +1 WS, tool connection reached level 100 in rank 1, upgrading to rank 2, connectivity will now increase bonus effect on tools further. Due to ranking. Up your tool connection skill, you gained +1 INT and +1 WIS, interesting. I don't quite understand what it's trying to tell me for my element, though," Eisen muttered out in a low voice, that only Bree seemed to have picked up. Something wrong?" she asked with her head tilted to the side, and Eisen shook his head. No, it's fine. But my magic element ranked up just now, and it says that its state can be changed independently of other active areas, and I don't know what it means." Eisen laughed softly, so Bree immediately began to explain. "Well, until now, if you changed the state of your magic, it was probably affecting every single part of the infused mana, right? I think now you can change some parts into one state, and another into a whole different state." Eisen listened closely and nodded with a loud, "ah," and crossed his arms. "So that's how it is, huh?" He laughed, and in the middle of that, stopped abruptly as an idea popped into his head. But he needed a bit more space for that, so he would need to do it once the group was driving again. For now, the only thing that was left to do was wait for the steel parts of the tools and the dagger to be finished. While they were waiting, they sat around in a circle and talked to the owner of the shop for a while. But soon enough, the parts of the tools were finally finished, and Eisen grabbed them and waited for them to cool down before placing them into Bree's backpack. BVEC. After thanking the owner of the smithy once more, Eisen set Melissa down on his shoulder and grabbed Korea's hand again before the group left to head for the carriage again so that Eisen could continue making the tools. Now then, I'll finish the dagger first, Eisen said while cracking his knuckles, and sat down at his work table, grabbing some wood to work with. Quickly, he grabbed a piece of wood and began carving it into the shape of a wooden handle for the dagger, and then created a small hole at its core. So in order to push the metal part of the handle into this more easily, Eisen heated it up with his magic element and then pushed it into the wood to cause a perfect fit. Once that was done, Eisen could have probably just handed this in, but he rather felt like adding another important part, leather. This would make it easier to grab the dagger for a long time, so it made a lot of sense to add it. So, after grabbing his X-Acto knife, Eisen cut some leather into a long, thin band. Its underside was then covered with some simple glue, and wrapped around the wooden handle. It took a little bit of time for the glue to set properly, but it fit quite well. Steel dagger, quality. Perfect, rank. 3. Description: a simple steel dagger created by the Omni craftsmaster Eisen. Effect: +5 AGI, +3 STR, +2 END, for creating an overwhelming quality item, you gain +1 STR, alright, let's bring this to the guild, then. Eisen exclaimed loudly, and Komer shot up from leaning against the wall. Huh, already? But didn't you just start like half an hour ago? He asked confused, and was simply met with Eisen's soft chuckle paired with a nod, before the old man left the carriage, only saying one thing. You guys wait here, I'll be back in a bit. I'll hurry up so we can leave again soon. Eisen explained, immediately rushing off out of the stable without giving anyone in the group a chance to react. He really wanted to try out that idea he got when his Flame of the Earth magic ranked up again, after all. Not long after Eisen left, he already returned with the rewards from his finished request as well as another new request. While Komer and Bree wanted to sit around and relax for a while, Eisen immediately connected Kabaram to the carriage and began driving it outside, toward the gate in the direction where they needed to go. Eisen. Why are you even in such a hurry? Did something happen? Bree asked concerned, looking at Eisen through the opening at the front of the carriage, and he turned his head with a smile. Well, you explained it to me yourself, didn't you? Just wait, you'll see what I'm planning. Eisen laughed and drove the carriage to a spot out of the way of other passing carriages, where he would be undisturbed for this experiment. He jumped off of the bench at the front of the carriage and was immediately joined by the rest of the group. Eisen stretched his hands out forward and pushed out as much mana as he could, shaping it into something that he stared at for basically hours at a time throughout his whole life. And although it looked basically just like a large block at first, once Eisen added a few details to it, it really did look like what he wanted it to look like, a forge. Luckily, since he would be making this with magic, it didn't require anything like pumps to heat up the flames, but simply his own magic power as fuel. So, Eisen was able to concentrate on the space itself, where he added a large enough center where a large amount of metal could fit, as well as an opening that would allow easy access to every part of the forge. It was basically a simple recreation of the forge he had in his own workshop in real life. Once this mana structure was finished, Eisen pushed out his Flame of the Earth element out of his palm and infused it into his pure mana, immediately changing it as far toward the earth state as he could, and now the whole thing turned into a structure of very rough rock, since his rank up allowed the element to turn further into each state. But that wasn't the only thing that changed. Just as Bree explained it to him before, it was now possible to change certain parts of the structure into pure flames while the rest stayed as rock. And as such, large flames shot up inside of the forge. They were already quite a bit hotter than they used to be, so Eisen hoped that this would actually work. And it seemed like the system wanted exactly something like this to happen, since it immediately accepted Eisen's recreation of a forge with his mana. Do you want to add the Flame of the Earth Forge spell to the spell library? Chapter 97 Traveling Craftsman. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. With a smile, Eisen looked at the magical forge in front of his eyes, while both Bree and Comer stared at it in a mixture of curiosity and surprise. What is that? What did you just do? The Fae kin Bree asked, and Comer nodded, wondering what Eisen did just as much. Eisen turned over to them with a smirk. I've just solved my blacksmithing problem, that's what I did. He said with excitement burrowed deep inside his voice, and stepped closer toward the structure, holding his hand over the fire to figure out how hot it actually is. Or rather, it will be a solution to my blacksmithing problem if I keep ranking my Flame of the Earth magic up. It's not hot enough yet. It can be used like a tempering oven like this, but not as a forge. He sighed loudly, shaking his head in disappointment while canceling the magic spell. After tilting her head to the side in thought, Bree's eyes finally began glittering excitedly. Oh, so that's what you meant. I explained to you what that new skill effect was. Bree, what do you mean? Comer asked confused. He still didn't know much about magic, so beside the fact that this was a forge that popped up out of thin air, he had no idea what was going on. Eisen's magic element can change states from pure fire, over to pure dirt or rock. So now that he can change what area has what state better, he managed to make the base of the forge out of his element turned over to rock, and the flames inside out of his element turned over to fire. She explained, and was happy to see that Eisen smiled at her while nodding, telling her that she got everything that he did right. So you can even do things like this with magic, huh? Now I'm really excited to see what my element will be. Comer exclaimed as Eisen stepped back toward the carriage. Sorry to basically drag you out of town for that. We can go back if you wanted to do something else there, but I really wanted to try this out. Eisen explained, but both Comer and Bree shook their heads. The young man smiled lightly while stepping back toward the carriage. No, it's fine, I don't really mind. And I've looked at some maps of the continent before, and it seems like it's going to take pretty long to get to Ornier, so it's better to move whenever we can, right Bree? Yeah, it should usually take about a week, maybe. So driving as much as we can really is a good idea, and since Kabaram doesn't need to sleep, we can basically keep going as long as any of us are awake. With a smile, Bree followed behind Comer. I see, then thanks, you too. Now then, shall we keep going? Eisen asked with a smile as he jumped back up onto the bench of the carriage, grabbing Kabaram's reins while Kuria climbed up and sat down next to him and Melissa crawled up his arm, Bree and Comer sitting in the back of the carriage. Happy that Eisen now figured out how to do the one thing he couldn't do while on the move up until now, he commanded Kabaram to start walking forward again, so that they could continue their journey toward the capital of Litgern, Ornier. It has been 3 days since then, and the group was now close to arriving at the town they were traveling toward for a while now. But they weren't just mindlessly driving the carriage forward, of course, and a few different things happened. First, Eisen finished the tools by simply carving wooden handles and attaching them to the steel heads. But that wasn't the only thing that Eisen did, as he also enchanted them to be more efficient. The pickaxe gained a crushing enchantment, so that it would easily break apart any rock that it contacted, while the axe was enchanted with a cutting enchantment to cut apart wood easily, and on the shovel, Eisen put a burrow enchantment for it to smoothly dig into the ground. He briefly tested them out before and after placing the enchantments, and while their effectiveness wasn't easy to see at the start, but soon the time that was saved like this built up and amounted to quite a big sum, so Eisen couldn't see them as failures in the slightest. Other than that, Eisen gained quite a lot of proficiency in different skills as well. He obviously continued crafting and as such gained some proficiency in his crafting skills, but he also gained a bit of proficiency in his truth-seeing eye skill to the point that it wasn't far from ranking up again, and was also nearly halfway toward ranking up his Flame of the Earth magic again. But Eisen also ranked up a bunch of skills. First off, he managed to rank up his riding-driving skill, and the effect didn't really help him much. Usually, it would have reduced the amount of stamina that the animal that was ridden or drawing the carriage would use up, but since Cab Aram didn't have any stamina, that didn't change anything. Aizen's cooking skill also ranked up once more, which didn't change much either, since it only ranked up to rank 1. His woodworking skill ranked up as well, allowing Aizen to work with extraordinary woods, as far as the effect told him. He didn't know what that meant exactly, but he figured it meant things that were changed beyond the laws of the real world through magic. As for the skills that changed things the most noticeably, one of them was definitely the Golmancy skill ranking up. Immediately, Aizen felt a change in Cab Aram's and Alu's behavior, and they responded to even simpler commands than they used to. Next, his tool connection skill ranked up as well, letting Aizen feel where his tools were that had at least a connectivity rank of 2, meaning that if he concentrated on one of them, he would feel something pulling him toward the tool's direction. It wouldn't actually physically affect him, it was just something like a gut feeling. In the end, this would mainly just be useful for people that were quite messy with their tools and kept misplacing them, as this only worked within a 50-meter radius of Aizen. And since Aizen treated his tools as well as he could, he probably wouldn't be using this feature too much. And at last, Aizen's a giant strength skill ranked up. What this did was that Aizen would be slightly resistant to blunt weapons while the skill was activated. It wasn't a lot, but it may still be enough to change the course of a battle. But since Aizen didn't fight that much at the time, that was only something he would need to worry about later. And there was one thing that made Aizen incredibly excited as well. It seemed like the royal jelly was a substance that would give a queen bee larva experience, enough to level them up one after another. Each day, that alone gave Melissa 20 level on average, and the rest was taken care of by Aizen doing the same thing he did with Kuria, having her, technically, be part of a fight, but finishing off the beasts himself. They did this whenever they noticed some kind of monster around them, so it didn't actually take all that long. So, Melissa was able to evolve. She turned from a queen bee larva, to a regular queen bee. And with that, she got a skill as well. Hive control. Not only would this allow her to literally control what was going on in her own hive, but also seemed to influence how many eggs she could lay and how many types of bees they could hatch into at this point. Her size changed a little bit, and she was about double the size that she was as a larva in, and instead of turning into a simple yellow and black color, the yellow seemed to be replaced by something similar to gold, at least optically, as it even glittered in the light. Now Aizen only had to think about what to do next. For sure, he could maybe have Melissa actually start her hive, but the only option for that would be the inside of the carriage then, and that didn't seem to be a good idea for many reasons. So setting something like that up would need to wait for a while until Aizen had something like an actual plot of land to construct things like this around. So for now, Melissa only laid 5 eggs, all of them soldier bees just to act as something like protection, that hatched within a few hours. It seemed like even though Aizen didn't technically tame these himself, as they were Melissa's minions, he could somewhat control the soldier bees as well. These soldiers were basically the same size as Melissa, but just a bit bulkier, and with an incredibly sharp stinger. But Aizen's other tamed monster didn't fall behind either. Kuria kept practicing her plant control over and over again, until she managed to get it to rank 2, and even brought mana manipulation to a point where she was close to ranking this up as well. Either way, the plant control skill ranking up allowed Bree to grow the plants beyond what they usually should be able to become. Meaning, she could for example increase the size of a small flower to be 2, 3, or even 4 times larger than usual. But in return, she could also make them smaller than they usually would be, even creating a tiny tree out of an acorn that may have been far smaller than usual, but was still technically like a regular-sized tree all the same. But right now, the group was taking a break together inside the carriage while Cab Aram and Alu were drinking some oil. Aizen checked the current real-life time and turned over to Bree with a smile. So when do you think we are going to reach Hornier? It isn't far anymore, right? No, it's really not. We just passed the border this morning, so it should only take about another 3 or 4 hours. Bree explained with a smile, while Comer was sitting on the bed, currently reading a book about different countries in the world that may be useful to him in figuring out the best sales tactics for each area they were in, which they bought when they stopped by a small village yesterday. Eisen nodded and looked down at Coria, who was sitting on his lap, as well as the 6 bees all clung to his arm. Many people would probably be freaked out by this, but for some reason, their large size and tendency to stick around Melissa made them far less threatening than regular-sized bees. Eisen actually somehow thought they were all quite cute when they were sitting on his arm like that. And Coria, Bree and Comer didn't seem to be bothered too much either, so everything was fine. I've still got a few hours left before I need to go to bed. You've been staying up for a while, right, Bree? How about you go to sleep? Eisen suggested, and Bree nodded slowly. Sure. I'm just somehow excited, you know. It's been so long since I've been to Ornier. The Fae Kin explained with a bright smile, only causing Eisen to chuckle in response. I see, that's understandable then. Alright, I'll reattach Kabaram to the carriage now, so we can keep going. You're probably pretty tired as well, right, Comer? Ha. Yeah, I'll go to bed in a bit. Just finishing this chapter about Litgern. Really want to be prepared for my first time independently and properly selling things on my own without scamming anyone. Comer laughed with embarrassment clearly in his voice, and Eisen couldn't blame him. Over the past few days, Comer has been realizing how bad what he was doing actually was. At first he didn't think it was too bad, since there were still some people that bought the items he sold, but those were all NPCs. Since the game allowed him to play like that, he thought maybe it wouldn't be too bad to continue like that, and always kept on lying, becoming more ridiculous each time. But once Comer actually took his time to inspect what he did from a position where he was thinking about all of these NPCs to be real humans, he began to see what was wrong. At least he realized his fault in the end. Either way, now it was time for them to finally arrive at Ornier, after they've been traveling for so long. Chapter 98 Original of Artistry. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Natalie Klein. There were few people anywhere in the world that didn't know this name. It belonged to the most famous actress, singer, songwriter, musician and artist in the world at the time. At a young age, she was found to be a prodigy in a multitude of creative fields, her personal focus always being on music or painting. There weren't many instruments that she didn't play wonderfully, but she was most notably talented with string instruments such as the guitar or the bass. Seeing her immense talent, her parents did everything they could to support her, letting her take private lessons in whatever field she wanted. Soon, she landed a few minor roles as a child actress and rushed up the ladder of starhood so quickly that if there was a movie starring Natalie Klein, it was bound to be a success. But not only as an actress was she successful at a young age, but also as a musician, making her debut at the young age of 15. She never stuck to a single genre for long, but when she was in a certain scene, she was always an immediate hit. Many would think that she earned more than enough money to live off of for the rest of her life before even turning 16, and she certainly did, but she nonetheless wanted to follow her passion, and as such chose to dive into painting and art history, studying this course at college after finishing high school early. So that she wouldn't stick out amongst the crowd, she was allowed to simply hand in assignments online and not attend classes, and while she was working diligently in college, she chose to start anew financially as well. She had her bank accounts locked for the duration of her attending college, and started to make money by selling different artwork online in order to pay for her tuition. Before she even earned her degree, Prime Industries approached her to have her help with the creation of a game at a level that has never been seen before. Since she did like to play video games every once in a while, she asked to hear more about it and then ended up accepting, instructing Prime Industries on how different areas of artistry should be handled inside such a complex game. Now, at the age of 20, she began playing this game a month before release as the original of artistry, not changing much about her outer appearance, and even her accent was fully exposed to the others that played. Usually, she tried to hide it to an amount because she was embarrassed to have such an incredibly cliché Southern accent, but she thought it would be a good chance to get over that while talking to people that didn't seem to react in any way when seeing her. Either they didn't care who she was, or they didn't know. Either way, Natalie, now known as Avelia, felt comfortable around this small group of people. When she started playing the game, she found herself in a small human town that was more than heavily focused around any kinds of arts, but before really doing anything, she met an elderly woman that near to immediately discovered that Avelia's experience was stolen. She helped Avelia out and made it so that she regained her human racial skill, as well as the title, Original of Artistry. For the next 1.5 in-game months, she then did a few different things. First, she learned a few art-related skills, such as sculpting, drawing and singing, as well as some skills related to instruments that ended up one after another combining into skills such as string, instrument proficiency, brass, instrument proficiency, or woodwind, instrument proficiency. In response to her skillful display of what she could do, she gained the occupation, Heavenly Artist. There wasn't anything actually heavenly or divine about it. It was simply something like a scaling system for artistic occupations. Once she gained this occupation, she started traveling around nearby towns as a bard, raising her level through doing quests or fighting against monsters, and most importantly raising her charisma stat, which she managed to push to the 60 range already. Now, she was currently residing at a large, luxurious inn in Ornier, the capital of the country she started playing in, Litgern. She managed to earn quite a lot of money already through selling artwork off the street and through donations after simple musical performances, so she had no problem with paying for this inn. She was lying on her bed with a scrappy guitar that she bought from a random merchant, trying to play a few songs, but it was working out far worse than she had hoped. This guitar is just horrible. The strings are way too stretched out. Why ain't there any proper instruments in this town? She yelled out and jumped up from the bed, laying the guitar down behind her. Maybe I should visit some shop to have myself some custom ones made. Avelia sighed loudly, grabbing her small backpack and strapping her guitar over her shoulder. She left her room and locked the door behind herself, stepping down the stairs into the lobby that was already quite busy, despite the early time. Good morning, Miss Avelia. Did you have a nice rest? The young concierge asked her with a smile as he opened the door for her, and she replied with a simple smile. Yes, I did, thank you very much. Could you tell me the way to the next art supply store? Avelia asked before the concierge nodded. Of course, Miss Avelia. Simply follow the main street for a few minutes until you get to see a clothing store called Mr. and Mistress, and then turn right. It should be on your left side if you keep walking for a few more minutes. He explained, and Avelia listened closely. Gotcha. Thanks for that, bud. She said and waved at the concierge while making her way along the route that was described to her. Immediately, she was greeted by a few people in town, mostly young men, that have seen some of her performances before. With a soft smile, she waved her hand at them and continued walking. It's actually been a while that she's been able to freely move around like this, and even though there were still people that knew her inside this game, it was only to the extent of recognizing someone from your neighborhood and greeting them, instead of hordes of fans running up to you and trying to get pictures and autographs. This was a nice feeling. Although it might change again once the regular player base was allowed to join the game. There already were a few of those Omegas in town now, and some of them apparently recognized her, but luckily they just stayed away. Soon enough, Avelia entered the art supply store that she could easily find through the concierge's instructions and took a look around. She grabbed a few canvases of different sizes and walked up to the counter and quickly bought them, tying all of the canvases together so that she could carry them more easily. Do you need an easel as well? The employee asked, seeing that it seemed like Avelia was carrying basically all of her belongings with her, and that she didn't have one such important artistic tool when it came to painting on canvas. But Avelia shook her head and waved at the employee as she was leaving. No thank you, I'm fine. She chuckled as she left the shop and made her way toward the closest town gate, where she would try and find a good spot to paint for a while. She already checked out the surrounding areas, and the view from that gate was truly beautiful. You could see the giant mountain ranges that shot through the clouds in the distance that seemed like enormous walls, and the forests and rivers below. It was really a perfect scenery to paint. So, Evelia walked through the large stone gate and looked around to find a nice way spot to start painting. She heard a few of the guards arguing about something, so she thought she would try and listen in to see if there was some kind of quest possibility, but it seemed like they were just arguing about some bees that some old man was carrying with them while entering the town. One of them was saying they shouldn't have let him in, while the other said that they were tamed beasts, so it was all right. Evelia figured that it was just some random conversation, and she wasn't really interested, so she just moved on to finding a nice spot. And it didn't take too long until she found a nice hill with a good view of everything, that at the same time looked to be somewhat away from the road so that not many people would come and bother her. She stepped up the hill and smiled, extending her hand forward as she slowly released mana from her hand as it turned into the shape of an easel. With a smile, Evelia placed one of the canvases onto the mana easel, before grabbing some of her brushes and placing them into her breast pocket, before pushing out more mana out of her hand that suddenly turned from pure white to a dark gray, while it also seemed to turn into something like a liquid. Evelia began humming as she dipped one of the first brushes into the liquid above her finger, before slowly moving it over the white canvas. What Evelia was using right now was her magic element, Colors of Beauty. It was really quite useful, since art supplies like paint were some of the most expensive things that one needed as an artist, so having something like this to use instead was definitely perfect, and helped Evelia save a lot of money. Or rather, it saved a lot of trips to art supply stores. When used on paintings, it would usually give it some kind of effect, for example accelerating mana or health recovery speed, to a person that looked at the painting for a prolonged period of time. But you couldn't only use it for regular paintings, as it could also be used as camouflage. Evelia could basically copy what a rock wall looked like, and then apply a layer of her magic element onto herself to make her harder to spot. It only worked when she was holding still, and it needed a certain amount of preparation, but it definitely worked quite well. This, combined with her momentarily charming and controlling monsters to attack other monsters, she was able to level up relatively easily once she earned this element. After a while, Evelia was finally finished with her painting of the scenery in front of her, and as she was quite happy with it, she grabbed it once it fully dried, carrying it with her back to town. Another good thing about using her magic element to paint was that it was easily removed from her paint brushes, and didn't need to be washed out. It was easy to do that in this game anyway, but it was still far quicker to be able to simply wipe the color away. So, after she went back into town, she decided to bring the painting to the marketplace to see if anyone wanted to buy it so that Evelia could make a little bit more money, because it could never hurt to have even more. She already knew a few people from here that bought some paintings of her before, and she knew that they would definitely pay a good price. But there was one thing that took her attention: a large crowd centered around a single person selling items. Come one, come all. Buy one of these items, and you will never regret it. We have potions, purses, weapons, and a multitude of mana crystals enchanted with whatever you may need. Chapter 99 First Sales. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Eisen's party in their carriage soon reached their destination, the town that they have been traveling toward for the past few days, Ornier. It had huge stone walls, and towers built along them where you could probably see for miles and miles from. It was quite early in the morning, and the sun just rose, so most laborers were leaving the town while the carriage was approaching the gate. It was actually quite an exciting sight for everyone in the group to see this town, but most so Comer, who has only seen villages or small towns so far. Halt! Inspection! One of the guards yelled out while another already approached the carriage from behind, opening the door without anyone in the group being able to say anything about it. Hey, you can't just come in here! Comer yelled out, while Olu jumped forward and growled at the guard, and Melissa's soldier bees prepared to defend the carriage as well. The guard immediately pulled his sword and held it forward, prepared to strike, but Aizen reacted quicker. Everyone, stop. Sorry, young man, please continue. Aizen said while looking into the carriage through the opening in the front, and immediately Alu laid back down onto the ground while Melissa and her soldiers flew over to Aizen, sticking onto his arm. In response, the guard frowned strongly and put away his sword again before taking a look around. After a few minutes, he was ready to leave, but chose not to at first. The cargo is fine, but you can't bring monsters into the town. The guard exclaimed, glaring through the room at Alu, Kuria, and at last also Melissa and her soldiers. Especially not those bees. If they decide to build a hive in there, it will be incredibly troublesome. And this actually kind of made Aizen angry. He turned around and returned the guard's glare, but tried to stay calm so as to not give him a reason to do anything dumb. That wolf is an artificial creation, and the Myconid girl and these bees have been tamed. Where is the problem? As I said, it doesn't matter if you have tamed them. If they escape your control and build a nest, it will be a danger to the town. So you can't bring them inside. Haven't you seen how they nearly attacked me just now? The guard responded angrily, and Aizen looked at the other guard who was patiently waiting for his college to be done. Young man, the guard inside here is trying to refuse me from taking my tames beasts with me. Aizen explained, and the guard outside sighed loudly and shook his head. Really? Sorry about that, sir. He's new at the job, and taking the not letting any monsters into the town part too seriously. If everything alright is fine, you can of course pass. The guard explained and walked up to the back of the group's carriage, forcefully pulling the other guard out of the carriage. You, behave. But he has monsters in there. And one of them is a queen bee. You know how fast they reproduce. The older guard of the two held his hand to his face and rubbed the bridge of his nose as if he had a headache, grabbing the arm of the younger, less experienced, guard by the arm and dragging him away. So what? A tamed monster can't escape its master's control. So just shut up and leave them be. But. The younger guard tried protesting, but stopped immediately when he saw his colleague's glare. The older of the two guards stepped to the front of the carriage to properly address Aizen. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir. Please, go right ahead and come through. But Aizen just shook his head, smiling at the understanding guard. Don't worry about it. I can understand if people are afraid of monsters, but these cuties here won't hurt anyone. He chuckled, and the guard smiled back with a nod, waving at other guards on the other side of the gate to tell them that a carriage was coming through. So, Aizen commanded Kabaram to continue walking forward, and they soon entered into the town. They made their way toward the center of town, from where they then chose to drive toward the marketplace in order to start their business immediately. It would always be busiest in the morning and evening, so it would be great if they could immediately start their work. For the past few days, Aizen has been continuously making a few different items. First, he has been filling up the glass bottles that he had with the health and mana potions from the 4 small barrels, turning the rest of the potions that he didn't have bottles for anymore into pills. He also created different tools or weapons that could be made purely out of wood like bows or staffs, since his magic still wasn't strong enough for him to properly heat up metal to smith. But he was able to use the smithy in a few different villages along the way, so he was also able to make a few simple swords and daggers, as well as a few spearheads. There weren't many, but a handful of metal weapons and tools were still in the collection of items that would be sold by Comer this morning. Other than that, Aizen also created some smaller items out of cloth and leather like purses, gloves or scarves. But the majority of items that Aizen has been working on were different mana crystals with a multitude of small enchantments. Nothing major, just things that could make things easier from day to day. For example, he made a few more self-filling mana crystal cups, small spinner toys for children that propelled themselves with wind, some flame-enchanted crystals that have been shaped to more easily and controlled start fires, as well as enchanted crystals that help in putting out fires easily. But those weren't all. Eisen was basically making any enchantment that he could come up with that might be useful in day-to-day life. And since, according to Bree, they didn't need a sales license to simply sell a few items off the street for a day. If they wanted to open a proper stall to stay there for a while or rent or buy a shop, then they would need one, but things like day stalls were a common occurrence basically everywhere. So, Eisen parked the carriage by the side of the marketplace, in front of which Comer quickly laid down a blanket, carefully arranging the different items and placing small signs in front of them to tell people who were interested what each item was and how much it would cost. Comer turned around to look at Eisen nervously, but the old man simply placed his hand on his shoulder and smiled. "Don't worry. If you can convince people to buy horrible items, you can do the same with items that are actually good. If you say so." Comer muttered out and closed his eyes, breathing out heavily before standing up. Both Coria and Bree prepared to help out and lure in more customers, while Eisen was watching from the side to let Comer do his own thing. And soon enough, people started taking a look at what was for sale, and most of them were immediately impressed. Even though they were just ranked 2 and 3 items, so were most items that were freely for sale, as many items started getting stat requirements from rank 3 on. The only reason this wasn't the case for Eisen's creations was that they weren't true rank 3 items, and they achieved this rank only through Eisen breaking the limit of his skill. Once his crafting skills reached rank 3 as well, his items would probably gain requirements as well. So of course people were happy that they could use all of these items without trouble, and especially kids were interested in the high-quality toys that were made with the use of different enchantments, and their parents thought the same. Not only would they just be fun to play around with, but at the same time, they would allow the children to be interested in magic and through repeated use of magic to activate the toys, would be able to train their mana manipulation slowly. And every parent would like their child to know magic. If they chose a magic-related crafting occupation, they would be able to learn quite a lot of money, since magic items were always more expensive than regular items, and if they chose a magic-related combat occupation, they wouldn't need to stand at the front line and instead be a supporter standing in the back, which was quite obviously far less dangerous. But these toys weren't the only items people were interested in, but after a while, others got interested in what was going on at that crowd, and a few rookie adventurers chose to buy some of the daggers, as they were high-quality, but still relatively cheap compared to what you could buy at most shops around the town. Actually, all kinds of people chose to take a look at what was being sold. Other merchants, adventurers, crafters, and then at last even a familiar young woman carrying a guitar and multiple canvases over her back, with one incredible painting that she was carrying in front of herself. Comer was currently yelling something out to attract more people, and it seemed to have worked on the young woman. While she was walking up to the crowd to take a look, Eisen walked up to her, tapping her shoulder to get her attention. "Ivalia. Is that you?" he asked, and the young woman immediately turned around. "Ha! Who's a skin? She exclaimed, looking up the moment that she turned to properly face the man standing in front of her. When she realized who was talking to her, her mouth turned up in a grin and she placed her hand onto her hip. "Oh Woodchaw, take a look at that. Long time no see, how've you been?" With a loud voice, Ivalia greeted Eisen while smiling brightly. "I'm all right. Just traveling a lot lately. What about you?" Eisen asked with a smile and pointed to the side where the two of them could talk without worrying about standing in the way of potential customers. "I've been doing just fine. Been traveling around, same as you." "So what are you doing here?" Ivalia asked, and he chuckled and pointed at the crowd. "I made the items being sold there. The kid selling them is an Omega, and I've been trying to turn him around from doing, well, not so great things. The pink-haired girl standing there is a companion of mine, and the other small girl there is a Myconid, a monster that I tamed. I can introduce them to you later." "Oh, so you're with those guys then, huh?" "Yeah, introduce me. And then let's talk about how everything's been working out for you in the last while." "Definitely, kid. You really are quite talented, huh?" As expected of a famous artist. Eisen laughed heartily while looking at the painting that Evelia was holding, and the young woman looked at him with surprise. So you really did know. Thanks for not making a big deal out of it, then. Of course I know, my grandkids are a huge fan of your movies and music. With a chuckle, Eisen laughed lowly before looking at the guitar on Evelia's back. Your guitar seems kind of beat up. Did you think about getting a new one? Evelia nodded and handed Eisen the painting she was holding for a second so that she could grab the guitar from her back, and then showed it to the old man in front of her while taking the painting back. Yeah, it ain't in great shape. Didn't have time to get to a music shop yet. Eisen scratched his beard and frowned gently with a smile on his lips. How about I make you a new one then?